Bryce with Cosplay. Today I'm going to be going over how I made the patterns and then did the actual assembly and building of the boots for my Super Mutant. Now these are all made from foam from TNT Cosplay Supply. They were pretty easy to make and I'm really happy with how they came together. So without further ado, here we go. Alright, so getting started on my Super Mutant here, I'm going to use my Reinhardt boot as my template to make sure that I've got the right size. So the first thing that I'm going to do is to go ahead and take a piece of poster board. There we are. Now I'm going to take this boot here and just trace the bottom so that I know what size I'm dealing with. There's the size base for my Reinhardt boot. Now, I want my Super Mutant boot to be a lot more similar to a tactical boot, as opposed to the shape of Reinhardt's boot. So, what we're going to do, we'll go ahead and Alright, so once you've got your boot pattern drawn out here, we're going to go ahead and just cut it out and make sure that we've got what we're looking for. Now, I accidentally had two pieces of poster board stuck together there. Just ignore that. You only need one. We're going to go ahead and round it out a little bit more, kind of clean the shape up a bit, just to make sure that we've got what we want. Now, I've got a bunch of these puzzle piece floor mats that I picked up off of Craigslist. They're used and pretty beat up. I wouldn't feel comfortable trying to use them for a costume, but for prototyping and building patterns and stuff, they work really well. If you don't have, garbage formats sitting around or anything like that, you can use cardboard or poster board. It works pretty well. Just go ahead and use some duct tape or whatever to hold your pieces together, and you can get a good basic form that way instead of having to go through and waste your good, your good foam that you want your finished product out of. And so we'll go ahead and just cut a bunch of strips here. Now these don't need to be exact. You're just, like I said, you're just building a basic shape here. This isn't our final boot. This is just going to be the pattern that we use to build the final boot. So now that we've got our pieces here, we're going to go ahead and take some barge cement and use that to attach the pieces to the base here. We're going to go ahead and build a cage, and basically we're just going to use strips of EVA foam. We're going to go ahead and just use scissors and cut them kind of rough. But all we're trying to do is create the basic shape of the boot that we want, so that we can go through and use some tape to make a pattern that we can use to transfer that to our 10mm foam and make a good quality boot in the shape that we need. Now this is one of those areas where if things don't match up exactly on each side or things like that, it doesn't matter. The biggest thing you want to look for is just building as close to the shape as you can. It doesn't need to be perfect, just your basic rough cuts and things like that. It's going to come together great. Now I've got my Reinhardt boot here for size comparison just to make sure, because I want to use the same stilts in my Super Mutant boot as I did in my Reinhardt boot, and keeping the two side by side like that, it helps me to make sure that I'm getting things the right size. Here for the next 2 or 3 minutes, I apologize for the video shrinking, and it's going to the video quality is going to break up a little bit and things for the next couple of minutes. I tried to stream this part on Facebook while I was recording it. Ended up with some connection issues and things like that that made the video kind of get gargled. It'll stop in a couple of minutes and go back to normal, so I do apologize for that. Kind of testing some new equipment and things with this video, and still in the learning process. Alright, so once you get your cage done, which we're just about at here, There we are. Okay, so with the cage finished and making sure that everything's the right size and things still there, we're going to go ahead and make our pattern. Now to do this, first thing we're going to do is take some aluminum foil and coat this boot with it. I like aluminum foil because it has a little bit of structure to it that as you're pushing it out, it kind of holds its form a little to help get those curves and stuff really well smoothed out. And so we'll just take and tape this aluminum foil on there. Next thing, we're going to take some saran wrap and just coat the whole thing in that, because I want the tape to come off easily. If you stick it straight to the EVA foam, it tends to stick, and when you're trying to pull your pattern pieces off, they can get hung up. You can end up tearing them and things like that. And so I like to use the saran wrap. Just like I said, it gives me something that's going to peel off easily. So we're going to take masking tape and just cover the entire boot. You can also use duct tape, kind of whatever is handy. I like masking tape because it's a little easier to sketch on and tends to be a little bit cheaper, but you can use whatever you've got. Once you've got your entire thing taped over, we're going to go ahead and take a Sharpie and just sketch on where we're going to cut the pattern off. As you're doing this, make sure you make little registration marks on it, just so that when you're putting your pieces back together, you know where to glue to make sure that everything stays lined up correctly. This is easy. Just make a little line through the a little line on the pattern where it cuts apart, and you're going to make that same line on your pieces on the foam, and just that way you know where everything lines up. So we'll go ahead and get the pattern all cut off here. Go ahead and clean up the edges a little bit where the saran wrap and stuff's sticking through, and just get them all ready to go. We're also going to have to take and cut some darts, especially here in the toe, to make sure that it lays flat. Alright, now that we've got our pattern done, we're ready to move on to building the actual boot itself. For this build, TNT Cosplay Supply provided us with some of their awesome quality EVA foam that we're going to be using for these pieces and the armor and such on the Super Mutant. TNT Cosplay Supply has excellent products. I highly recommend their foam. It's extremely high quality, very few air bubbles. It's great to work with, and it's smooth on both sides, so you don't have to worry about trying to sand off a texture or fight with it or anything like that. You can check them out at tntcosplaysupply.com, or if you're in the DFW area, they've got a store in Irving. So here, we're just cutting out our pattern, again making sure that we transfer those registration marks. You can see the little silver lines that I included on there to make sure that things are lined up as they go. We'll put our barge cement on, and that's going to have to dry for a few minutes, so I'm going to kind of be putting barge on things as I'm moving on to cut out the other pieces. Now, as you're cutting these pieces out, it's important that you keep your cuts straight and at a 90-degree angle. I'll be releasing another video in the near future that I'm going to kind of talk about some techniques to make sure that you're getting good, clean cuts and seams. It just takes a lot of practice is really what it comes down to, but you do want to be careful and make sure that you are getting those nice straight cuts. That way, when you glue things together, they're going to line up well and you're going to have clean seams and not have to worry about, trying to hide mistakes later. Okay, and one thing to talk about with barge cement here is that you want to make sure that you're not putting on your barge cement super thick. With barge cement, less is more. As you're putting your things on, I like to take a piece of scrap foam and kind of smooth it out, because if you've got thick gobs of barge cement there, again, it's going to cause your seams to be uneven or to not pair up as well as they should. And it just, again, it's things that you have to go back and try to hide later, and it's easier to avoid them the first time. So a thin coating of barge cement, making sure that it's on there smooth, go straight to the edge, and then just carefully pressing the seams together, making sure that they line up correctly, saves you a lot of headache in the long run. Go ahead and press those in, make sure that everything's lined up using those registration marks. Now, the tongue here we did ultimately decide not to use. I went with a little bit different pattern. We took it out using just a little bit of barge thinner on the Q-tip to loosen the seams there and be able to pull it out. We'll go through making sure we're lining everything up well and that our seams are flush. have it. So we've got our boot here. Now, if you look at an actual boot, it's got, you know, a toe guard and kick plate and things like that on there that they stick up a little bit. They're extra pieces of leather that are stitched on, and we're going to simulate that with our boot. First things first, we're going to cut those slits there to give us a place for the laces to be able to hang through. And we're going to take our masking tape again and use this to be able to make the pattern for our highlight pieces, if you will. Now, one thing that I find gets left off a lot on large-scale builds is small details. I'm a big fan of having a lot of small details in my work. I feel like it gives it a more completed appearance, as well as it's awesome for people to be able to look at something and see, you know, just tons and tons of little details. And I feel like it helps you to kind of hide mistakes even a little bit, because people just see all the detail that's put into it, and it lets them kind of focus on that instead of, you know, something that was maybe a little off kilter. So we'll go ahead and trim the sides of our tape here, and take a Sharpie and start sketching where we want these thin little highlight pieces that we're going to put on. Alright, now, just like before, we're going to go ahead and cut these pieces off. Now this time I'm going to go ahead and fix them to a piece of poster board, just so I can make a little bit more sturdy pattern as we go through and cut a bunch of them out. Now the places, as you saw there, the places where it overlaps, I'm cutting it out. I went ahead and went in and added a couple of pieces of tape so that I'd have those extra pieces on the patterns. That way when it overlaps, I don't have to worry about just, you know, trying to round it out or whatever. It's easier to just do it in the pattern. You'll also notice that all the pattern pieces are labeled. I find it easier to do that, and I'll also label which one is the front and which one is the back so that I know which one goes on the left and which one goes on the right boot. And this is what I was talking about using the saran wrap for right here. I went ahead and went straight to the EVA with these, and as you can see, it's sticking a little bit. Now the toe here, again, we're going to have to cut some darts just to make sure that everything will lay flat. And I'll take a piece of scrap poster board to attach to the back just because it kind of overran the piece that I had a little bit. Get all of our pattern pieces cut out here. And again, as you're cutting your patterns out, just like with your foam, take your time, make sure that you're cutting, you know, on your lines where you want them to be, and making a good, you know, good quality pattern. So for these pieces, I'm going to be using this 2mm EVA 70 from TNT Cosplay Supply. It's an extremely dense 2mm foam. It's a lot harder than the normal EVA 38, and that's going to make it a lot more durable. So that, because these are the feet, as they're bashed into things and whatnot, I don't have to worry about it getting caught on things and damaged. Also, the EVA 70, it holds its shape a lot more rigidly just because it is more dense. I'm a big fan. You can sew through it. It's fantastic stuff. TNT gave me a sample of it a little while back, and I've been hooked on it ever since. It's a phenomenal product that I highly recommend if you're looking for a very durable thin foam. And as you can see on my pattern here, I sketched one of them twice, go in one direction, had to flip it over and do it again, and just ignore the one that was the wrong way. So we'll go ahead and cut out these patterns here. Now again, like I said, I like detail a lot, and so as I'm going through with these, before I attach them to the boot themselves, I'm going to go through and add a little bit more detail by running it through the sewing machine and adding some stitching around the corners so that these look like they're sewn on pieces like on an actual boot. Alright, so I'm drawing lines on where the sewing needs to happen. We'll go ahead and glue the toe together. And now it's off to the sewing machine. Alright, as you can see, we've got our stitching in there. With the EVA 70, it's going to hold in great. It's not going to weaken the foam or anything like that. And because I'm sealing with the latex that I am, that detail is going to be able to hold over, and you'll be able to see it really well on the final product. So the boot is going to look like it's been stitched together like a normal leather boot would be. We'll go ahead and get all of these glued on real quick. Now my roll of paper here, I just picked up a cheap roll of medical paper like they use to cover the chairs at doctor's offices and things like that. It only costs a few dollars a roll, and it's a lifesaver for being able to keep your workspace clean. I highly recommend it. I just took a wooden dowel through some eyelets in the edge of my workbench and made a roll that I can pull out and clean up. Like I said, it's been great. So again, making sure that the EVA foam is smooth and flush, that we're not, having it gooped on in large quantities in places or things like that. We want a good, smooth, even coat. Alright, go ahead and get our pieces all affixed here. And some of them are going to overlap, like we talked about. We want to make sure that we're putting a little bit more glue on the ends where those are going to overlap so that they're glued down on the entire thing. Go through carefully lining everything up, smoothing it down, making sure that it's all adhered well. Now here's the tongue that I ended up trading out to because I wanted it to actually loop around and move forward against the laces like the tongue of an actual boot. So we'll go ahead and get things ready to kind of tack that down. Mark out where I want my laces to be, and we'll go ahead and just drill through those holes, or drill through those areas to make holes. so that we can lace our boot when we get to that point. Okay, so we've got our lace holes in. Now we're going to go through and just install that tongue that we cut out. And like I said, this way it's going to kind of press forward against the laces, have a little bit of overlap there, and just look a little more real than the original one that we had. I'm going to take my Dremel tool with a 220 grit sanding drum on there to smooth out the corners. The smoother sand or the higher grit sanding drum that you use, the better it's going to look. If you use a really rough 60 grit or whatever sanding drum, then you can kind of tell a textural difference between the areas that you've dremeled and the rest of your piece, and it makes it look a little more fake. Now we're going to hit it with a heat gun real quick just to seal the pores in the EVA foam, and that's going to help us to get a smoother finish when we seal it. Now it's ready to go. So we've got our first coat here on of Monster 407 mask latex, and we want to simulate it looking like an old boot. So now we're going to be using some Monster liquid latex and a piece of upholstery foam that I just cut a small piece from some scraps, and we're just going to kind of dab it on there in places that we want to rough up the texture and make it look like the leather of the boot has been, you know, brushed up against rocks or beat up and things like that. And we're just going to kind of build that texture up so that when we come back through and paint it later, not only do we have a difference in color, but we have a textural difference that helps to make the boot look like it's actually been used and worn and beat up. So we'll go through and just dab it on here. Given the option, I prefer to seal my products with the Monster 407 mask latex. I like it better than I like Plasti Dip. I feel like I get a little bit smoother coat, as well as it holding the fine details a little bit better with things like stitching and such. However, it does require a critter gun and an air compressor. You have to dilute it with a little bit of water, and there's some trial and error to get the thickness right. But you can add some acrylic paints and stuff to color your latex so you can get whatever color of undercoat you need, and it's just a great way to get really good details, and it's very durable. Now if you don't have access to that, a can of Plasti Dip works great. Just make sure you put it in a cup of warm water for 10 minutes or so before you use it, and it'll still give you a pretty good smooth coat that'll be a good durable finish, and it's a lot more readily accessible. So you just use what you have access to. So here we are thinking about where things are going to be, you know, scuffed up, putting a little bit of texture in where the laces will have rubbed into the leather, and getting it finished and ready to go. So now we're going to go ahead and put on that second coat of mask latex. And as you can see here, you can still see the stitching really well. It's maintained those details, and that's going to help it to look great. Now, because we sealed it with latex, we're going to have to paint it with rubber cement paints. Normal acrylic paints won't bond to latex. Rubber cement paint is made by mixing equal parts of naphtha and rubber cement. Naphtha puts out some nasty fumes, so you want to make sure that you're wearing a respirator, taking care of yourself. My shop also has an exhaust fan that I'm going to be running during this process. You want to make sure you're taking care of your lungs. So the rubber cement paint is pigmented by dissolving oil paints in the rubber cement paint base. What it's going to do is that naphtha is going to dissolve those rubber cement paints and leave behind the pigments. The nice thing with rubber cement paints is that they're extremely flexible, so you don't have to worry about, as things get bent or moved around, you don't have to worry about your paint cracking and peeling. It also dries very quickly. So we'll go ahead and mix a few different colors of our rubber cement paints. Now, as with all painting, the big thing in getting a realistic final look is all about layering. You're going to be doing multiple coats with different, you know, slight variations of the color and things like that to create a blending effect and help to make this look like a leather boot. So we'll mix that together with just my little milk frother thing here. Take a foam brush and just paint it on. Like I said, naphtha, it dries extremely quickly. So your rubber cement paints, you can paint them on, and it doesn't take but a minute or two before it's dried. We'll continue on, paint the whole thing here, and then next up we'll do another layer of the brown with maybe a little bit of olive green in it, and then brown with some black, and as you get those layers built up, it's just going to make it look more and more real. And because we're doing multiple layers, you don't need to worry about making sure that, every layer is completely covered or that there's no brush strokes visible at all, because like I said, we're doing multiple layers. And honestly, you kind of want, with organic things like leather or skin, you kind of want there to be a little bit of variance in the color scheme. It's not going to be completely one note. So once we get done with the rubber cement paints, we're going to seal it with a matte varnish. I like to use Liquitex Professional Matte. If I wanted a shiny piece, I've also got their gloss varnish. It's just a liquid varnish that you put on with a brush. Works extremely well on rubber cement paints. That way they lose their tackiness, and you get some protection there just to make sure that your colors don't fade and that everything stays looking great. So here we've got our boot. It's all painted. We've got our first coat of the varnish on there. And now we're going to start adding some details. First things first, I'm going to use some black paracord to create laces. Just put a little bit of shrink wrap over the ends. Now, as I was shooting this video, I noticed that it looks like that cord is going to be kind of getting in the way of a couple of things like my torch later. It's actually lower, so the torch, it's a lot further away from that power cord than it looks like it is. So we're going to go ahead and lace up half of it just so that I can measure out how long those laces need to be. Add another piece of shrink wrap. There we are. And we'll go ahead and just lace up our boot. Tightening the laces in a little bit, again, kind of force the boot into shape. I'm going to put a little bit of super glue on my knot just to make sure that I don't end up with my shoe coming untied halfway through a convention and getting caught on something and dying on my stilts. I'm also putting a little bit of glue on the inside just to make sure that everything's held together really well. Okay. So now that we've got the laces done, the next thing we're going to do is going to be to add a bit of a sole. For this, I'm going to use more of that black EVA 70. we're going to cut about a 4-inch piece so that I can give myself some overlap around the edge of the boot. So we're marking out how big it needs to be, or how long it needs to be, just by wrapping the piece around the boot. Go ahead and get it cut out here. Okay, so now I've got my pieces of EVA 70. I'm going to go ahead and cut a second one because I have 2 boots. Okay, and again, I like details, and so we're going to take these pieces of EVA 70, run them through the sewing machine, add some stitching. Now the next thing that we're going to do is to fold them in half, and that way when I put them on, it's going to maintain, or it's going to stay lined up and look like it's a flush sole. So we'll go ahead and push it in half and just crease it for now. There we go. Now I'm going to hit it with my torch real quick just to kind of warm it up and make sure that it holds that form where I've got it creased. If you're using a torch, please be careful. A heat gun is certainly safer. I just grabbed the torch because it's faster. It doesn't have to warm up or anything like that. Now we've got our boot here. We're going to mark 1 inch up from the bottom all the way around. And I'm going 1 inch up from the bottom of the EVA, or the 10mm foam. You'll notice the toe kind of drags down low a little bit. The reason that I'm doing at 1 inch is that gives me an extra inch of overlap on the bottom that I can use to help kind of smooth everything out and create a nice flush look. And because the EVA 70 is as tough as it is, if that little bit extra off the bottom hits the ground and a little bit, it's not going to damage it. But my stilts will actually keep these, assuming that they fit just like my Reinhardt boots, they'll actually keep them just a little bit off the ground anyway. And so I'm not too worried about that foam getting beat up down there at the bottom. So put a little bit of barge cement around there on the inside and outside. Put some barge cement in on our piece of EVA 70. Alright, now that that's had a minute to dry, we'll go ahead and get it put on the bottom of our boot. Making sure that we stay lined up with that 1 inch line that we drew around. We'll just press it into place. I'm going to put just a little bit of super glue on the back there where the 2 pieces meet to make sure that they stay nice and smooth. Spray with a little bit of accelerator so that it dries instantly. And there we have a boot. The last thing that we have left to do is to hit it with some weathering and make it look real. So to do this, we're going to use an old ratty chip brush and a couple of various shades of tan and brown, and put just a very little bit on the brush and kind of lightly blend it in, especially in those areas where we put the extra latex on it earlier to create that rougher texture. So we'll go through and just keep adding more and more, using various colors, blending it in, and just working our way up. We're definitely going to want to put some on, places where it's rubbed, like the laces and things, as well as feathering a little bit on the corners of all of that 2mm foam, so that it looks there again like you've got the edge of a piece of leather. And this whole process is going to be just about going back and forth, like I said, various colors and things like that, and just lightly coloring it in, blending it in, adding it, dabbing it off with the paper towel until you get it to look like you want it to. Weathering is my favorite part of the building process. I feel like this is where things really get brought to life, but it does take some patience. It's not a fast process, but I feel like it's definitely worth it. Alright, now I've got some paint here that I've mixed up some bright red blood type of paint, and I'm just spattering it on and then dabbing it off because, again, the super mutants, they're kind of violent. There's usually a lot of blood and gore, dead animals and stuff around where you find them, along with people and things and whatever. And so I'm wanting it to look like there's been blood spattered and then cleaned off of the boots. I'm using a rubber cement paint here that I've mixed some red and black in, and the reason I'm doing that is because it dries so fast that, like real blood, the corners of the paint are going to dry really quickly, and so when I'm dabbing off those dots and splotches, it's going to leave kind of the same halo, I guess, or outline of where the blood was that it would if it was the real thing. For most of my weathering, and I should have pointed this out earlier, most of my weathering I did with acrylic paints. Acrylics won't stick to latex, but now that I've gotten the rubber cement paints on the top, and then I've gotten the varnish on the top of that and everything, they'll stick fine for the weathering. I'm not going to have any issues there with them. So we'll sit and kind of just work that blood in. Now we're going to work some dirt and weathering over the top of it. Again, kind of blending everything together. And we'll just keep going until it hits a point that I'm happy with it. I'm going to take some smoke colored paint from model paints and things like that, and put it on there so it looks like there's maybe a little bit of oil that's been dripped on the boot. And once we get all of that done, I'm going to take just some black acrylic and dilute it down quite a bit with some water. Now I'm going to use this to just kind of splash all over the boot, spatter it and things like that, and then I'm going to wipe it off, just because there again it adds a little bit more grime and a little bit more depth to the piece. And there you have it, the finished boot. Thanks for joining me. I appreciate it. I hope you guys gained something from this video. I had a lot of fun making it. And we're hoping to do several in the future as we continue this process. So again, thank you. I've been Bryce with Frostbite Cosplay, and have a great rest of your day.